Richard here. This next one's a quiet one, but stay close. It earns every minute. Hazel Doyle had heard plenty of things said about her size over the course of 26 years, and not one of them, not a single solitary one, had ever come out sounding like a compliment. So when Caleb Whitfield looked at her across a crowded supply store in the town of Briar Hollow, Colorado, and said the words, "Whoever marries you is going to be a lucky man," Hazel did not hear kindness. She heard the opening line of a joke she'd been the punchline of more times than she could count, and she braced herself, same as she always did, for whatever cruel turn was coming next. It never came. And that single misunderstanding, the gap between what Caleb Whitfield actually meant and what 26 years of being laughed at had taught Hazel Doyle to expect, was about to change both their lives more completely than either one of them could have guessed standing in that store. Now let me back up, because you need to understand exactly how deep that bracing went before you can understand what happened next. Hazel had grown up the biggest girl in every room she'd ever stood in. At school, at church, at the handful of dances she'd been dragged to as a girl, before she'd learned to simply stop attending them. Her own brothers used to call her Big Haze at the supper table, not even meaning unkindness by it most days, just careless the way brothers are careless, never once stopping to notice how she went quiet every time the words landed. By the time she was 16, she'd developed a particular skill that had nothing to do with cooking or sewing, or any of the things a girl in Briar Hollow was supposed to be skilled at. She'd developed the skill of hearing a sentence start and finishing it herself in her head before the other person could, always landing on the worst possible ending, because the worst possible ending was the one that had been true the most often. So when Caleb Whitfield, the quiet, sun-weathered young rancher who kept mostly to himself, and had never once, in 3 years of Hazel seeing him around town, said more than a handful of words to anybody, looked directly at her over a barrel of feed corn and said that sentence, "Whoever marries you is going to be a lucky man," her mind did exactly what 26 years of practice had trained it to do. It finished the sentence for him. Because nobody, she thought, says a sentence like that to a girl built like her and means it plain. There's always a hook in it. Lucky how, she remembers thinking, with her face already going hot. Lucky because she'll work twice as hard to make up for how she looks. Lucky because nobody else would have her, so she'll be grateful for anything? She didn't wait to find out which cruel ending he had planned. She set down the sack of flour she'd been holding, said something short and clipped about needing to get home before supper, and walked out of that store so fast she left her own basket sitting on the counter. I want you to sit with that moment a second, because here's the thing about Caleb Whitfield that Hazel didn't know yet, and wouldn't know for a good while longer. He hadn't meant a single unkind thing by that sentence. He'd meant it exactly as plain and simple as it sounded, and he'd spent the better part of the walk home that evening turning over in his mind why in the world she'd gone so pale and bolted the way she had, wondering if he'd said something wrong without realizing it, the way a careful man does when he knows he's not naturally smooth with words and worries he's botched something important without meaning to. He had not botched it. The botching, if you want to call it that, had happened to Hazel Doyle years before Caleb Whitfield ever opened his mouth, at the hands of a town that had spent her whole life teaching her that kindness aimed at her was either a mistake, a setup, or a lie. And that's the real story here, folks. Not just what happened between these two, but how long it took for one honest man's plain words to start undoing what an entire town's careless words had spent 2 decades building. Caleb didn't let it drop, though, and that's the part of this story I find myself thinking about more than almost any other detail in it. A lesser man, told off or avoided after trying to pay a compliment, might have shrugged it away and decided the woman simply wasn't interested, might have nursed a bruised pride and moved on to easier company. Caleb Whitfield, instead, spent the better part of 2 weeks doing something far more unusual. He asked around, quiet and careful, not gossiping, just listening, trying to understand what exactly he'd stepped on without meaning to. And what he heard, piece by piece, from the handful of people in Briar Hollow who actually knew Hazel Doyle, rather than just knowing about her, started to paint a picture that troubled him a good deal more than her bolting out of that store ever had. He heard that she ran her father's horse operation almost single-handed, had done so for 3 years since her father's hip had gone bad, and that she had a gift with green-broke horses that bordered on the uncanny. Animals that bucked off every hand in the county would stand quiet and easy under her touch inside an hour, though almost nobody outside her own family seemed to know or care to mention it, because the conversation about Hazel Doyle in Briar Hollow had never once, in living memory, been about horses. It had always, every single time, circled back around to her size, as though that one fact about her was the only fact worth discussing, the way a single loud noise in a quiet room drowns out every other sound happening at the same time. I want you to really picture this part. Caleb rode out to the Doyle place on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks after the feed store, not to apologize, because he'd decided by then he hadn't done anything that needed apologizing for, but to ask Hazel Doyle a direct question, the same plain way he'd asked the first one that had sent her running. He found her in the round pen behind the barn, working a young gelding that had thrown 3 different hands over the past month, a horse the whole county had more or less written off as unbreakable. She didn't see him ride up at first, too focused on the animal in front of her, moving slow and unhurried around the pen, her voice pitched low and even, her whole body loose in a way Caleb had never once seen it in town, where she carried herself braced tight as a fence wire, like she was always waiting for the next unkind word to land. Out here, with nothing but a nervous horse paying her any attention, she moved like a different woman entirely. He sat his own horse at the fence and watched for a good 10 minutes before she noticed him. And in that 10 minutes, that gelding went from snorting and wheeling at the far end of the pen to standing still enough that Hazel laid a hand flat against its neck, and it didn't so much as flinch. "You've got a gift," Caleb said, when she finally looked up and found him there, and watched her whole body go tight again, the same bracing he'd seen in the feed store, the same readiness for whatever cruel turn she expected next. "I mean that plain," he added quickly, before she could bolt the way she had the first time. "I've never seen anybody settle a horse like that. Not my own father, and he broke horses 40 years running before he passed." "You don't have to say that," Hazel said, and her voice had gone careful, in a way that told him exactly how much practice she'd had at being careful. "I don't have to say a single thing I say," Caleb said. "That's rather the point of saying it. I came out here today, Miss Doyle, because I said something to you 2 weeks back in the feed store, and you left so fast you forgot your basket, and I've been turning it over in my head ever since, trying to work out what exactly I said wrong, because for the life of me, I can't find the wrong in it." Hazel looked at him for a long moment, the gelding shifting restless behind her, sensing the change in her attention. "You said whoever marries me would be lucky. she said finally, flat. "I've heard that kind of sentence before, Mr. Whitfield. It generally doesn't end the way it starts." "How does it generally end?" She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice had gone quieter, stripped down to something far more honest than the careful tone from a moment before. "It ends with somebody explaining that I'll make a man lucky on account of I'll never expect much, on account of nobody else is fool enough to want a woman my size, on account of I'll be grateful enough for any scrap of attention that I won't cause a husband a lick of trouble." She looked back at the horse rather than at him. "That's the ending I've heard. More than once." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, something in his voice had changed, gone lower and rougher around the edges, in a way that told Hazel, even before she fully understood the words, that she was hearing something true. "I watched you settle a horse just now that's thrown 3 grown men this month," he said. "I've been raising and breaking horses since I was 7 years old, Miss Doyle, and what you just did in that pen, I couldn't do it, not with 30 years of trying. I said whoever marries you would be lucky, because I watched you work a horse like that's a gift most folks would trade their whole spread for. And because I asked around town after you left and found out you've been running your father's whole operation single-handed for 3 years. And not one soul in this town seems to think that's worth mentioning when they talk about you. They'd rather talk about your size than your hands. And your hands, Miss Doyle, are about the finest I've ever seen with a green horse." He paused. "That's the ending to my sentence. There isn't another one hiding behind it. I'm sorry this town's taught you to go looking for one." Now, folks, I want you to sit with that a second, because this is the turn the whole story hinges on. Right here in this round pen with a half-broke gelding standing between them. Hazel Doyle had spent 26 years building an entire skill around finishing other people's sentences before they could finish them themselves, always landing on the cruelest possible ending, because the cruelest ending had always, without exception, turned out to be the true one. And here, for the first time in longer than she could remember, a man had said the kind thing, and meant only the kind thing, and had nothing hiding underneath it at all. She didn't know what to do with that. She stood there in the round pen with her hands still resting on the gelding's neck, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 26 years loosened just slightly. Just enough that she felt it the way you feel a held breath finally let go. "I don't know what to say to that," she said honestly, which was, Caleb would come to understand over the following months, about the most truthful thing Hazel Doyle had said to anybody in a very long while. "You don't have to say anything," Caleb said. "I just needed you to know the sentence was finished honest, same as I'd want anybody to know if I'd said it to them." He nodded toward the gelding. "Now, if you've got the patience for it, I'd be obliged if you'd show me what you did with that horse's hindquarters there at the start. I've got a colt back home I haven't been able to get anywhere close with, and watching you just now, I'm starting to think the trouble's been me the whole time, not the horse." And that, friends, if you can believe it, is exactly how it started. Not with a grand gesture, not with flowers or a formal courtship the whole town could gossip about, but with a man asking a woman to teach him something she actually knew better than he did. Plain as that, and meaning it every bit as honestly as he'd meant the sentence that had sent her running 2 weeks before. If you're enjoying this one so far, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and drop your city down in the comments. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's keep going, because what happened over the next several months is going to surprise you. Caleb came back the following week with his colt, same as he'd said he would, and Hazel, who had spent a decade being talked about rather than talked to, found herself doing something she hadn't done in longer than she could remember, explaining her work out loud, in detail, to somebody who was actually listening rather than simply waiting for her to finish so he could change the subject back to safer ground. She showed him how to read the set of a horse's ears, the particular shift of weight that told you a buck was coming before the horse itself had fully decided on it. The patient business of letting a frightened animal choose to trust you rather than forcing trust onto it through pressure and rope. Caleb, for his part, turned out to be a quick study and an even quicker admirer, though it took him the better part of a month to say so plainly, careful as he was not to spook her the way he might have spooked one of his own green horses with too much pressure too soon. It was Hazel's father, Otis Doyle, laid up still with his bad hip, who noticed the change in his daughter before Hazel herself fully let herself notice it. She'd started humming while she worked, something she hadn't done since she was a girl small enough not to know yet what the town thought of her size. Otis mentioned it once, gently, from his chair on the porch, watching Caleb Whitfield's horse tied up at the rail, same as it had been 3 afternoons that week alone, and Hazel had gone red and changed the subject so fast that Otis, who'd raised 3 children and buried a wife and knew a thing or two about reading a room, simply smiled to himself and let it lie. It was around the 3rd month of Caleb's regular visits that the trouble started. And I want you to lean in close here, because this is where the story really earns its keep. Briar Hollow was a small enough town that nothing stayed quiet for long, and word had gotten around that Caleb Whitfield, considered by half the unmarried women in the county to be the most eligible bachelor for 30 miles, had taken to riding out to the Doyle place 3 and 4 times a week, and the town, same as towns do, could not let that pass without deciding it needed explaining. The explaining mostly fell to a woman named Cordelia Vance, who ran the boarding house in town and had, for reasons of her own that mostly involved a daughter of marrying age and an unmarried niece besides, decided that Caleb Whitfield's attention toward Hazel Doyle was a puzzle requiring a solution rather than simply a man choosing where he wanted to spend his time. Cordelia began suggesting, quietly at first, and then with less and less quiet as the weeks went on, that there had to be a reason behind it that didn't involve genuine regard, that Hazel must have some manner of hold over him, financial trouble in the Whitfield accounts that Otis Doyle's land or horses might solve, or, simpler still, that Caleb was merely being kind to a pitiable case the way a decent man sometimes is, and that decency was being mistaken, foolishly, for courtship. These rumors reached Hazel the way rumors always do, sideways and through somebody who claimed they were only telling her for her own good. And for one bad week, they nearly undid everything that round pen conversation had started to loosen in her chest. She'd gone quiet again, careful again, and when Caleb rode out that Thursday, same as always, she met him at the gate rather than in the barn, and told him plain that perhaps he ought to stop coming round so often, on account of the talk it was causing in town, on account of her not wanting to be the reason decent folks thought less of him. Caleb sat his horse at that gate for a long moment, looking at her with an expression she'd come to know well over 3 months. The same steady, unhurried look he gave a nervous horse before deciding exactly how to approach it. "Tell me plain," he said. Is it the talk troubling you? Or is it that some part of you still believes the talk might be true? Hazel didn't answer right away, and that silence told its own story. I've spent 3 months out here, Caleb said, learning more about horses from you than I learned in 20 years before it. And I've spent every one of those visits looking forward to the next one, the same way a man looks forward to the one good thing in an otherwise ordinary week. I haven't been kind to you, Miss Doyle. I've been selfish about it, if you want the plain truth. Because I like your company better than anybody else's in this county. And I don't much care what Cordelia Vance has decided that means, on account of Cordelia Vance has never once in her life settled a green horse or run a working ranch single-handed for 3 years. And I'd sooner trust your judgment about a great many things over hers. He dismounted, slow and unhurried, same as he approached every frightened animal, and stood at the gate across from her. I'm going to ask you something, he said, and I want you to actually hear the whole sentence this time before you finish it yourself. Will you marry me, Hazel? Not because anybody'd be lucky to have you, though that's still true and I'll keep saying it till you believe it. I'm asking because I've never once in my life felt as settled as I do sitting on a fence rail watching you work. And I don't aim to spend the rest of my days finding that out from a distance, because this town can't mind its own business. This time Hazel Doyle did not finish the sentence for him. She let him say the whole of it, every word, and when it was done, she found that for the first time in 26 years, there was no cruel ending hiding underneath it, no hook, no trap, nothing at all, but a plain, honest man standing at her gate, meaning exactly what he said. Yes, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected it to. Yes, Caleb, I'll marry you. They married that spring, in a small ceremony at the Doyle Ranch, with nothing more than family and the few folks in Briar Hollow who'd actually bothered over the years to know Hazel Doyle, rather than simply talk about her. Cordelia Vance attended anyway, near as anybody could tell out of pure curiosity to see how it would all turn out, and left, by most accounts, looking considerably less certain of her theories than she'd arrived. Otis Doyle gave his daughter away from a chair set near the altar, his bad hip not quite up to standing the whole ceremony through, and cried without any embarrassment at all when Hazel walked past him on Caleb's arm rather than alone, the way she'd long ago decided she'd likely walk through most of her life. Within 2 years, the Whitfield-Doyle operation, as folks in the county came to call it once the 2 ranches combined, had the finest reputation for gentle, well-mannered horses anywhere in that part of Colorado, and ranchers rode in from 3 counties over, asking specifically for Hazel to work their most troubled animals, paying good money for the privilege, the same gift the whole town had spent 26 years failing to notice, suddenly worth more to outsiders than every unkind word Briar Hollow had ever wasted on her size. Caleb Whitfield, for his part, never did stop saying that sentence, not once in all the years that followed. Whoever marries you will be lucky, he'd say sometimes, low and easy, watching her work a horse in the round pen, same as that first afternoon. And every single time, Hazel Doyle would roll her eyes at him, same as any wife rolls her eyes at a husband's favorite old joke. But she never once again finished that sentence with a cruel ending, because she'd learned, finally, after 26 years of bracing for the worst, that sometimes a kind sentence is exactly what it sounds like, and the only trick hiding inside it is the trick of finally believing it. Well, that's the story, friends. 26 years of waiting for the other shoe to drop, and it never did, not once. Tell me down in the comments if you've ever caught yourself finishing somebody's sentence the way Hazel did, expecting the worst before you'd even heard the rest of it. And don't forget to drop your city so I can see how far this one travels tonight. I've got plenty more of these waiting for you, so subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you on the next one. This is Richard. Take care of each other out there.